Okay, here we are for our, which week? Let me just check and see which week. I meant to get the syllabus out. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Ninth week we are. And tonight we're going to discuss Saladin first and then Richard Lionheart. Actually, I have Frederick Barbarossa down here, but and I had notes on him, but I didn't bring anything. So we'll just mention Frederick Barbarossa, whatever I have in my memory, which isn't very much. But he didn't do much either. Remember that he drowned on the way, so he didn't have much to do with the Crusades. Okay, I suggested to you last time that we were going to do a kind of discussion this week. And since I announced that, only half the class is here. But I'm happy to see that Green Gary is here. Gary, would you like to participate in this discussion also?
I'll sure try.
Okay, good. We're depending on you. How about Jonathan at the full color site? Is Jonathan there? Nope. Okay. Well, nobody wants to discuss. Okay. You know, I was going to sort of give you background information in a lecture and then discuss, but maybe we'll do a little bit of discussion first and then a little bit of discussion at the end in order for you not to be intimidated and to get into the habit of sitting there silently while I lecture. Okay, does anybody remember some of the questions I raised last week for you to think about? Anybody remember those questions? Yeah, Matthew? No, you don't remember. Okay. Anybody else remember any questions I brought up? Yeah?
You had said something about, since those are the heroes, what does that say about the population that made them the heroes?
Yeah, since these people are the heroes, since Saladin is the Muslim hero and Richard Lionheart is the Frankish hero, in order to find out, you know, you can understand what a culture is like by knowing what its heroes are like, because a hero is someone that they admire. They admire all the qualities of that person, and that's what everybody in that culture strives for and strives to be. A hero is kind of the ideal of what that culture and what everyone aspires to in that culture. There can be women heroes as well as men heroes. And so, so what, now you read Arab historians of the Crusades, and fully 1/3 of this book is actually on Saladin. I mean, the huge central part of this book is on Saladin. And first it goes through his character, and then it goes through all the things he did on the crusade, his activities and behaviors. So we have sort of two things. On the one hand, we have the character of a hero and what kind of character he is. On the other hand, we have the behaviors, the actual actions of that character. And so do you have the impression from reading Arab historians of the Crusades that this guy admires Saladin?
I would tend to say so. Just he admired him just a little bit.
Just a teeny bit. He kind of likes Saladin. Yeah. Okay. And what are the things about Saladin that he especially praises? Okay. Just off the top of your head from what you've read.
The fact that he's generous to a fault, very generous to a fault.
Very generous, okay. What does that say that he's generous? What does the characteristic of generosity represent? What does it symbolize? Yeah.
That he's probably a humble person. He's not a greedy person. If he's generous,
okay.
He's willing to give whatever he has and offer.
He's a generous person in that wealth doesn't mean a lot to him and possessions don't mean a lot to him because he's willing to give it all away. Okay, so wealth, he's not ambitious for wealth and that's all he wants. And what else can you tie it to, this generosity? Yeah.
His faith, Dr. Valley.
His fame, Gary?
No, it's faith. One of the tenets of Islam, the charity.
Excellent. Okay, so he follows the faith. Yeah, charity is one of one of the 5 tenets of the faith. So that's also what it represents, that he's a good Muslim. Okay, what other characteristics does this book show Saladin having? Yeah.
I would like to say something. You said that he wasn't, his generosity says that he's not ambitious for money, but I think that he was very ambitious for power.
Good.
The way that he unified everything and just took control.
You know, I wonder whether that is a deliberate portrayal on the part of the chroniclers here, and there are several different ones who report this, that he certainly, was he hungry for power, or did it just fall into his hands, or did God want him to have the power? You know, I mean, but certainly he went after power and he got it. Okay, what does that say? Yeah.
I was going to say that also depends on the situation. I think in a time of war, you're more than likely to have to take control, and whether it might come off to be an ambitious perception per se, but it may not actually be that.
That he's ambitious for power, but it may not actually be. Okay, this is kind of a tough one to look at here. I mean, clearly he wanted power and he got it. He went after power and he got it. And they can't hide that in talking about him. But they might not view it negatively. The Muslim chroniclers might not view that as a negative thing. Why? Can you think of any reasons why, Matthew? Yeah.
Because he wasn't gaining all this power for his own personal gain. He was gaining it for the good of Islam.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. So, I mean, why was it for the good of Islam, Travis? Yeah.
Well, I was going to say he didn't ever misuse it. It sounded like, from the chroniclers, it sounded like he was had a very strong sense of justice, and he wasn't hoarding wealth like it said.
Yeah, when he got his wealth, he gave it all away, and he was happy to give it away. But as far as power goes, you know, he was needed. A powerful man was needed at that time to save Islam, because Islam had disintegrated and the Seljuk Turks had broken up the unity of everything. And Zengi is also a hero. And so Saladin then completed that process of pulling them all back together into unity. And remember that the essence of Islam is a unified community ruled by one ruler. One ruler. I mean, that's what Islam is. It started out with Muhammad ruling everything, and when he died, there was a caliph who took over and ruled everything in his name, and they were used, that was their concept of good government, a holy man at the head of a unified Islam. And so, in this sense, he fulfills some of the goals of Islam, doesn't he? Some of the perceptions of ideal government he fulfills here, and in many other ways he fulfills their perceptions of ideal government, at least as they're reported in these chronicles. Any other comments about what kind of a character Saladin is? What about jihad? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Mary.
Well, I think this may also go back to the issues of generosity and charity. And he seemed to be supportive of those less fortunate.
She is pressing the mic.
And the light is on. Yeah.
Okay.
He seemed to be supportive of those who were less fortunate than he.
Yeah, supportive of those who were less fortunate than he. I'll repeat what you say if your mic's not working. Supportive of those who were less fortunate. And what precept of Islam does that tend to emphasize? The fact that he took care of those less fortunate. What precept of Islam does that emphasize? It's not one of the 5 pillars. It's the equality of everybody before God, that everybody is equal before God, so that just because you're poor, that doesn't mean you're less of a person. And that is one of the really strange things about Islam that I have a problem with, is that they can believe so fervently in the equality of all believers before God, and yet Islam accepts slavery as a rightful condition of society. And one might say, well, they just enslave unbelievers, and so they tend to look at unbelievers as somehow not equal to Muslims, but they have Muslim slaves. You know, they will convert their believers, and when they will convert their slaves, and when the slaves convert, they're not necessarily freed because they're Muslims. And so slavery plays a very large role in Muslim society, as I've said before. But they will try to treat their slaves well, but nevertheless they believe in slavery. And any other particular comments you want to make about this portrayal in heroic mode of Saladin? Yeah.
The one really major detractor is his treatment of the Teutonic and and Hospitaller Knights.
Okay, what did he do to those?
They got slaughtered. They were utterly eradicated.
Utterly eradicated with no mercy. They were utterly slaughtered. Okay. We in Western society don't admire that, but I can see how in Muslim society that can be admired. They were unbelievers. They were enemies of God. Enemies of Islam are enemies of God. And so to slaughter them was just and justified. And he's always portrayed as a just hero. Okay? Another comment.
I don't know. Maybe it was just my my individual reading of it, but it seems like the Arab historians were not quite as praising of Saladin when he would slaughter the knights as they were in other situations.
Oh, you did think that. Well, let's take a look and see what they say right there. I think I have it marked.
I'm not saying that they don't, that they don't praise it, but on the greater scheme of things, on the different levels of praising, it seems like they didn't praise him quite nearly as much in that area as they did in other parts.
Okay. Here it is, Saladin's treatment of the Templars and Hospitallers, beheading them and causing general rejoicing at their extermination. Okay, let's see. He sought out, 2 days after the victory, he sought out the Templars and Hospitallers who had been captured and said, I shall purify the land of these two impure races. He assigned 50 dinar to every man who had taken one of them prisoner, and immediately the army brought forward at least 100 of them. He ordered that they should be beheaded, choosing to have them dead rather than in prison. And with him was a whole band of scholars and Sufis and a certain number of devout men and ascetics. Each begged to be allowed to kill one of them, and drew his sword and rolled back his sleeve. Saladin, his face joyful, was sitting on his dais. The unbelievers showed black despair. The troops were drawn up in their ranks. The amirs stood in double file. There were some who slashed and cut cleanly and were thanked for it, some who refused and failed to act and were excused. Now that's interesting. Some refused to kill them. Isn't that interesting? Some who made fools of themselves, and others took their places. I saw there the man who laughed scornfully and slaughtered, who spoke and acted, how many promises he fulfilled, how much praise he won, the eternal rewards he secured with the blood he had shed, the pious works added to his account with a neck severed by him. Okay, these guys are earning rewards in heaven by slaughtering them. How many blades did he stain with blood for a victory he longed for? How many lances did he brandish against the lion he captured? How many ills did he cure by the ills he brought upon a Templar? How much strength did he give to the leaders whom he supported? How many banners did he unfurl against disasters that retreated? I saw how he killed unbelief to give life to Islam, and destroyed polytheism to build monotheism, and drove decisions through to their conclusion to satisfy the community of the faithful, and cut down the enemies in the defense of friends. I don't see I don't see any excuse for. I mean, I see him just celebrating this slaughter as a grand triumph. That's how it reads to me. The slaughter of the Templars and the Hospitallers. But there was another place where examples of his justice. But he, all that matters is justice to Muslims. Westerners don't count in this scheme of things. Okay, his unfailing goodness. He is good to everyone. Great modesty and extraordinary affability to his guests. He would not permit anyone who visited him to leave without eating with him or to ask for something without receiving it. Everyone who appeared before him was treated with honor, even an infidel. Okay, now here is a contradictory statement. The Prince of Antioch came to visit him, appearing unexpectedly at the mouth of his tent after the truce of November 1192 had been signed, and Saladin was returning from Jerusalem to Damascus. He came upon him suddenly on the journey and presented a plea to him, and the Sultan made a gift of Al-Umq, a territory that he had taken from him in the year of his conquest of Palestine in 1188 to 89. Again, when the ruler of Sidon came to Nazareth, I saw him receive him with reverence and honor and divide his food with him, even offering him the chance of embracing Islam, describing its prayers and exhorting him to be converted. He showed equal generosity to religious leaders, scholars, and men of virtue and reputation, and directed us that every well-known religious leader visiting the camp should be presented to him so that he could show him hospitality. Okay, so there are cases where he is showing hospitality to the Westerners. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. On page 103, there's a sentence that's he invited the man to embrace Islam, which is the same phrase that was used there.
Yeah.
And the sentence finishes, and when he refused, gave the order for his head to be cut off.
Okay, that's interesting. Good bit of evidence there. This was no sooner had he come down from the Tal than a Frank captured from the enemy army was brought to him. Okay, so this was a prisoner of war who was not allowed to convert to Islam. Okay, we've got sort of mixed proof here. One would have to go through and count every reference to what he did to the Franks and sort of line them all up and see where the balance is on whether he was treating people well or badly. Yeah.
Also on page 163, about and I don't know if this is an indictment on Saladin himself or the whole of Islam, when it talks about how the women were treated after the conquest of Jerusalem. Top
Yes.
of 163.
Yes, I had that passage. Underlined as well. Let me read that to you. This is quite interesting. Women and children together came to 8,000 and were quickly divided up among us, bringing a smile to Muslim faces at their lamentations. How many well-guarded women were profaned, how many queens were ruled, and nubile girls married, and noble women given away, and miserly women forced to yield themselves, and women who had been kept hidden stripped of their modesty, and serious women made ridiculous, and women kept in private now set in public, and free women occupied, and precious ones used for hard work, and pretty things put to the test, and virgins dishonored, and proud women deflowered, and lovely women's red lips kissed, and dark women prostrated, and untamed ones tamed, and happy ones made to weep. How many noblemen took them as concubines, how many ardent men blazed for one of them, and celibates were satisfied by them, and thirsty men sated by them, and turbulent men able to give vent to their passion. How many lovely women were the exclusive property of one man, how many great ladies were sold at low prices, and close ones set at a distance, and lofty ones abased, and savage ones captured, and those accustomed to thrones dragged down. And he says that in great triumph with an exclamation point. Then the next sentence says, when Jerusalem was purified of the filth of the hellish Franks and had stripped off her vile garments to put on the robe of honors. Oh, okay, I mean, this is not This is not restrained language here. I mean, this is a celebration of their victory, which naturally, you know, the conquest of Jerusalem is a great victory to recover Jerusalem, and they don't restrain themselves in praising Saladin for doing this. Yeah, Travis, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just thought this was especially poignant after we had the discussion with our guest panel several weeks ago, and how important it was for the women to be chaste. Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, that chastity is so crucial to Islam, and so the way to abase these women is through rape, essentially, and what they're doing is raping these women. That's how they're debasing them. Speaking of Frankish women, did anybody catch that section at the end? This is by a different chronicler. I forget which one, this one, but Frankish Women of Peace and War at 204, page 204. The Islamic view of Frankish women is utterly distorted. I mean, this is quite an extraordinary passage where it talks about the arrival by ship of 300 lovely Frankish women full of youth and beauty assembled from beyond the sea and offering themselves for sin. Okay, that's why the Frankish women are coming to this territory, to offer themselves for sin. They were expatriates come to help expatriates, ready to cheer the fallen and sustained in turn to give support and assistance, and they glowed with ardor for carnal intercourse. They were all licentious harlots, proud and scornful, who took and gave, foul-fleshed and sinful, singers and coquettes, appearing proudly in public, ardent and inflamed, tinted and painted, desirable and appetizing, exquisite and graceful, and it goes on and on and on in this really extreme language about how licentious these women were and how lustful they were. I mean, that's the whole theme of what he's doing. Pink-faced and unblushing, black-eyed and bullying, loving and passionate, bold and ardent, and he's just absolutely scornful for these women, and he doesn't tell us exactly why, but he just assumes that all Frankish women are harlots, all of them, all of them. Yeah, did you have a comment, Mary?
Well, I do, but it involves the other book in the Chronicle of the Third Crusades. At page 28, the description that's given of Saladin is substantially different.
Oh, good.
Including the fact that, you know, he basically starts his career as a pimp.
Yes, actually, that's true. That's true that he does. He kind of starts his career as a pimp. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay.
I didn't want us to miss that. I thought that was only fair.
Okay, and his origin, Saladin received the first auspices of his future power under Nur al-Din, Sultan of Damascus, and Saladin collected ill-gotten gains for himself from a levy on the girls of Damascus. They were not allowed to practice as prostitutes unless they had obtained at a price a license from him for carrying on the profession of lust. However, whatever he gained by pimping like this, he paid back generously by funding plays. Okay, I guess funding plays makes up for funding prostitutes. So through lavish giving to all their desires, he won the mercenary favor of the common people. Okay. But that's accepted as true by the main biographer of Saladin, and this is Saladin and the Politics of Holy War by Malcolm Cameron Lyons and D.E.P. Jackson, which is the reigning book on authority on Saladin. This is a massive book with everything you ever wanted to know about Saladin. And what he uses in this book, in addition to both the Eastern and the Western chroniclers, is a set of letters that were written at Saladin's court, some of them written by Saladin himself. And so he comes out, Saladin comes off, you know, less angelic than he does in the sources, in the at least in the Islamic sources, but maybe not as bad as he comes off in the Western sources. And even the Western sources see him as heroic and chivalric, though, don't they? How about his military prowess? Don't they praise him for his military prowess? Yeah, Matthew.
I mean, because the Western idea is give credit where credit's due, even if it is to the enemy.
Yeah. Well, sometimes in the Arab Chronicles, they will praise a heroic Frank. Yeah, Travis.
But if they do, they finish that sentence with "God damn them."
Yeah, that's true. That's pretty interesting too. What do you see in this about their sense of nationhood and nationality in the Islamic chronicles? Where are their loyalties to their country? What do you see the situation in these Arab chronicles? Mary. Oh, press your mic.
I'm almost inclined to say that they were sort of looking out for their own, for themselves, their own individual selves.
Yeah.
Not so much the big grand picture.
Even Saladin is looking out for himself. He's not necessarily loyal to any one leader that he fights under in the beginning of his career. Any other observations that you make about the loyalties that they have? Yeah.
It seems like the people's loyalty are to an individual. They're not regional or not national. When Saladin was in power, he had everything under control, but then when he died, it all broke up.
Yeah, it broke up briefly. But then the Mamluks later on took power and unified. So it's like they need a strong hand to unify everyone, and so that's admired. A strong leader is admired. Yeah.
I think it was interesting about Richard Lionheart. His people were devoted to him with very similar loyalties that Saladin and his people shared.
That's quite interesting too, and that might just be a medieval thing, because it's medieval times. It seemed to me that there were a lot more words said in praise of Islam, of the unity of the religion, and there's not a sense of nationalities as we have in the Western Frankish rulers. Yeah, Matthew.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you hear all the time about the Frankish or the Flemish or the Anglo-Saxons, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But you don't hear about the Saracens or the Kurds or the Turks or anything like that.
Yeah.
With one exception, I think it was a letter between Richard Lionheart it was Barbarossa and Saladin, where Barbarossa says we're gonna bring the Franks, we're gonna bring the Flemish, we're gonna bring the Lombards, etc. Blah 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 blah. We're gonna bring all these different nations to the Holy Land to destroy you. And then in reply, Saladin says, we'll bring the Kurds, we'll bring the Saracens, we'll bring the Turks, we'll bring all these different peoples from Africa and slaughter you back. Yeah, that's, I mean, that's one time where I really saw a nationality differentiation in any of the Islamic views.
Yeah, it seemed to me that overwhelmingly they refer to Islam, to the religion, that Islam, Islam superseded every other loyalty that they had. However, and this is said in this book on Saladin by Lyons and Jackson also, that oops, I'm losing my microphone. He also says that there are no class lines, really, of division between the different groups, but where there is grouping of groups within the Islamic world, it is by more or less racial or tribal groups, not nationalities or regions, but like the Kurds or like the Turks, or it's more like groups, tribes or clans or racial groups. And none are particularly looked down upon because everybody is equal under Islam, but they have different characteristics and different customs within each of the tribes, and so they're sort of lumped together. And they do tend to group together. He also says that when they lived in the various cities of the Islamic world, the large cities, there were quarters for each of the groups. Like there would be a Kurds quarter, and there would be an Arabs quarter, and there would be a Turks quarter, and so on in each of the different cities. So they did tend to group themselves in their ethnic groups. I guess ethnic groups is a better thing. Okay, well, that was an interesting sort of start on this, and let me go through. And what I did in my lecture was to try to give you some background to the readings that you're doing. And so I wanted to look at Saladin and give you a little more background information. The career of Saladin is unique because of the sheer volume of information, and there's more written about Saladin than any other individual in the Muslim world, except Muhammad, of course. But I mean, Saladin is such a hero that the sheer volume of information outweighs everyone else. And interestingly, he's a Kurd. He's comes from the northern part of Iraq, from a tribe, from a line of the family of two Kurdish brothers, Ayub and Shirka, who lived near Dvin, near Tiflis, and they moved to Iraq, and I'll show you the general region where that is in a moment. Ayub was appointed the castellan of Takrit by the Seljuk Sultan, but the Seljuk power was disintegrating, and as the Seljuk power weakened, Zengi established his independent power in Mosul, and Mosul is the name they had for essentially I guess you would call it Iraq today, but the Sultanate of Baghdad is down here in southern Iraq. Mosul is in northern Iraq, and this is the area where the Kurds are from, just in the north, and even, spilling into Turkey as they are today. That's where they are today, right? Okay, and here is this genealogy that I gave you last time, so that we can see the heritage. There's a father, Shadhu, and here is Shirka. Well, this is spelled somewhat differently, but Ayub, and both of them are generals in the army of the Atabegs of Mosul. Saladin is here, and he has a brother, Malik al-Adil, who he shares power with. And then these are his nephews who actually divide up all of the power when Saladin dies. Okay. Yusuf Saladin, and his name was Yusuf, Joseph, was the son of Ayub, and he was born as the two brothers were expelled by the administrator Birhraz, who was under the Sultan of Mosul. Birhraz was called the Christian's friend. And the two brothers were expelled for killing a Christian, but then later on, Zengi kept them on, and Shirka took service under Zengi's successor, Nur al-Din. Ayub was in charge of Baalbek, which was besieged by forces from Damascus, and he surrendered. So there was civil war going on in the Muslim world, and it's, as Matthew said, it's every man for himself. They're all trying to get their own, grab as much power as they can. When Ayub had to surrender Damascus, had to surrender Baalbek to the forces from Damascus, he himself went to Damascus, not necessarily as a prisoner, but that's where Saladin grew up. And Saladin had at least 5 brothers and some sisters, and he was a middle child in all of this family. He had a traditional childhood education, and there's a quote in this biography of Saladin that says, I was educated in the way of the elders, as everyone should be. And so as your father is educated, that's how you are educated, and that's how you educate your son in the Muslim world. So he had a traditional childhood education in the way of the Muslim, and the Quran was at the heart of this education, with the sciences of religion being the core of that educational program. He also learned a common cultural heritage based on Arab tradition, so he abandoned his Kurdish tradition and did not even, take on any Mesopotamian tradition, but Arab tradition permeated everything. Saladin was said to have had knowledge of the genealogies, the biographies, and the histories of the Arabs, going back as far as he could, and also of their horses. So, and this shows you how important horses are to this culture, which is a similarity to the West, isn't it? That the horses are very important. Saladin is said to have learned by heart the Hamasa of Abu Taman, which was a ready-made set of values and attitudes, at times contradictory, but it is an ethical education, a set of values and attitudes that he had learned by heart. But also as a male child and as a warrior at heart, he learned shooting and riding and playing polo as a child and participated in these kinds of sports. In the Arab world, which he was part of, adolescence was short. Children had to grow up fast, and even at the age of 14 and 15, they were on the battlefield with their fathers, and Saladin did that. He fought in his father's and his uncle's armies at the start of his career, and to quote the historians, taking part in victories and leading troops against the unbelievers. And here is that, again, that emphasis when they go to war. Usually, well, when they go to war against each other, they speak of the armies of Damascus, or they speak of the armies of Syria, or they speak of the armies of the Turks. But anybody else who's a non-Muslim, they speak of the wars against unbelievers, and they think of most wars as against unbelievers. And interestingly, he was probably of the higher peasant class, maybe the middle class, but not of the aristocratic class. But clearly he was marked out early for command, largely because of the training that was given to him by his uncles and his fathers. It was a relatively egalitarian society, but as I said, divided into groups according to race or ethnic identity, not class. Under Nur al-Din, because Nur al-Din unified most of the Muslim world, they focused against the Franks, and the Franks became the major enemy and the major activity of the state. Saladin's rise to power started in 1163 when Shirkuh, his uncle, led forces to conquer a weakened Egypt, which was now ruled by an 11-year-old boy and was plagued with civil war. There were actually two factions and two rival viziers. Those of you who know Islamic history, the ruler in not Islamic but Egyptian, the ruler in Egypt was a vizier, and traditionally it had always been a pharaoh in olden times. And when Islam took over, and even when the Greeks took over, they took over the whole Egyptian bureaucracy. And so the caliph might have been the religious ruler in name, but the vizier was the practical ruler who did the day-to-day governing. And so they kept this system in Egypt. And so there was civil war between two rival viziers. Saladin had independent command by 1164. In these wars, he had his own command, but Shirkuh was in control, and Shirkuh reinstalled the deposed Fatimid vizier Shawar and deposed the other guy who had taken over. Once Shawar got back in power in Egypt, he refused to give Nur al-Din 1/3 of Egypt's grain revenues as he had promised in payment for this aid to get back in power. And then he turned around and he allied himself to Amari, king of Jerusalem, who then brought his forces down and fought on the side of Shawar, the Fatimid vizier of Egypt, against the forces of Shirkuh. Shawar hoped to play off the Franks against the Syrians and play them off against everybody else. He was just sort of power mad, far more than Saladin was, in fact, if you compare them. Nur al-Din took advantage of the situation to crush Bohemond of Antioch and Raymond of Tripoli. And this was sort of on the other front of the frontier. Shirkuh, meanwhile, finally withdrew from Egypt with a payment of 30,000 dinars, and there's no record of Saladin's role in these battles. And this is not a very enlightening period of the battles going back and forth and the switching of alliances. You kind of have the idea that it's rather shameful for Shawar to ally himself with the Franks, and also for the Franks to ally themselves with him. Saladin's first post, however, was as police chief of Damascus, and there is the famous part where he becomes a pimp. He raised money for himself by instituting a license for prostitutes, which was paid to him personally. And so did he want money, or was he supporting prostitutes? I mean, your guess is as good as mine, and that's open to interpretation. He also, but he wanted power. He clearly wanted power because he confiscated some of the functions of the learned Kamal al-Din al-Sharazuri, who was one of the wise men, one of the Islamic scholars who was actually ruling the city. And what Saladin did was usurp the power of this man who was the Qadi of Damascus, a kind of religious judge who had the power to rule. Shirkuh now set out to conquer Egypt against Shawar and the Franks, and in this battle Saladin was a general, and he distinguished himself in one of Shirkuh's remarkable victories, and this great victory where Shirkuh has something like 2,000 men against 30,000 men from Egypt and the Franks, and he, by a clever trick, he wins this battle. And then Shirkuh takes over Alexandria, and Saladin, when Shirkuh and his troops occupy Alexandria and take it over, Saladin was actually put in charge of Alexandria after Shirkuh conquered it. But then Shirkuh left Alexandria and went away and left a garrison there under the command of Saladin. And here we can look at our map to pinpoint Alexandria, which is right over here. They had actually tried to conquer Cairo, which had been more difficult, but now they conquered Alexandria, and Saladin was left there with a small garrison. And then the Franks and Shawar came and besieged the city, and Saladin defended the besieged city heroically with a small force. Shirkuh ended up rescuing him and his Syrian force by surrendering the city, and Saladin was saved because Shirkuh had conquered some of the, had imprisoned some of the Franks, and he did a prisoner exchange and traded all of his troops that were in Alexandria for Franks, and this marked Saladin's coming of age. Eventually, Egypt fell to Shirkuh, who was appointed vizier of Fatimid Egypt. But Shirkuh died in his 3rd month of office. When he was appointed as the vizier of Fatimid Egypt, in fact, Nur al-Din was very unhappy, because Nur al-Din was trying to unseat the Fatimids because they were Shiites and Nur al-Din was a Sunni, and he didn't want the Fatimid regime to go on. And in a way, Shirkuh betrayed him by opportunistically accepting the office of Fatimid vizier and leaving the Fatimids in power. He did, what he did was to order that none of the Fatimids aristocrats and officers could marry anymore, that they were not allowed to marry because he didn't want them to breed, and he didn't want them to have children who would inherit. And so this automatically would make the Sunnis inherit Nur al-Din's people. But interestingly, Shirkuh died in his 3rd month in office, and there were rumors that he was poisoned because, in fact, the city of Cairo rose up against him, and they were very upset at the putting of Shirkuh in power. His forces, his army consisted of Kurds like himself and Saladin, and Turks and Mamluks who were semi-slaves. Nur al-Din then chose Saladin among the very many candidates to succeed Shirkuh as the vizier of Egypt, and he chose Saladin to succeed his uncle because, to quote him, "there is no one weaker or younger." And most of the forces there refused to obey him. He was just a downy-cheeked kid. I mean, he was only about 21 when he was made Grand Vizier of all of Egypt. And so there he was, and Nur al-Din picked him, expecting him to fall from power, to be assassinated like his uncle, and he'd get rid of him that way. And most of the forces in Cairo refused to obey him. And it's a great tribute to the intelligence and the political skill of Saladin that he made that situation work for him, and he was able to impose his power on all of Egypt. So he was an extraordinary ruler. Okay, and here is Saladin, this wonderful 18th, 19th century picture I have for you. I'm sorry I don't have a real portrayal of him that I could find uncopyrighted, but this is an imaginary picture of Saladin. And here is a picture of Alexandria. This is a view of Alexandria, the palace and all of the buildings. It's a walled city all around here. And the different mosques that are here, the outlying areas. Okay, so this is what Alexandria would have looked like. The Mediterranean Sea here. And here is the necropolis of Cairo, and you can see Cairo in the background. These are very, very large cities. By European standards, they're gigantic. People are very amazed at how big they are in Europe. The Europeans were just dumbfounded when they went to these cities. Egypt, of course, had its traditions going back thousands of years, and the peasant life was unchanged. And a lot of the life of Egypt had remained unchanged no matter who the rulers were. They had held on to their old ways like this farmer. And of course, the Nile dominated everything as it did then, and here in this 19th century picture, it dominated life in the 19th century as well. So the Nile was the force of life. Here is the Mosque of Muhammad Ali in Egypt. That is the most important mosque. Saladin owed his position to a combination of good fortune, intrigue, and ability in his early career. He now, quote, repented of wine drinking and turned from frivolity to, quote, assume the dress of religion. Okay, this implies that he went through a transformation, and this implies that before he became the vizier, he engaged in lots of wine drinking in the taverns, and the Christians pictured him as a patron of prostitution, campaigning in the tavern, studying dice, and that he only got religion at the point where he assumed his office. Okay, now what do you think about this comment by the Muslim chroniclers? What do you think about that?
I want to say that it makes it's an attempt to to belittle anything that he's done, but I mean it is rather ironic. I mean he going from being a drunkard and a womanizer, a pimp, and then becoming this great religious and political and military leader of all of Islam. It's just really ironic, given the two sides of it, and the only difference between him before and him now is that he became vizier of Egypt, and that was simply because he was so weak and young that no one would pay attention to him.
So when he was young, he sort of sowed his wild oats, and he had a good time and did anything he wanted to. Can we see it as a kind of maturing, that maybe it sobered him up and he became very serious and took the seriousness of his office more responsibly? Can you think of it as a kind of coming of age, maybe, that he suddenly grew up and changed his ways? Or what would have made him change his ways? The responsibility that he had for ruling the people? Because remember that the ruler in Islam has the responsibility for virtually everything to do with the people. What do you think, Travis?
I would say that he got a taste of power, and he decided to pursue that instead of wine and women.
Okay, maybe so. Certainly he grew to be the most powerful person in the Islamic world. Yeah.
Or maybe it was a combination of both.
Or maybe a combination of both, yeah. But he started out as a really young man. I mean, and so, young people have to learn sometimes. Okay, we've sort of talked about some of these questions already. What I did here was go through and look at some of the comments about Saladin's character. Yeah, comment.
I'm sorry, I forgot to say. Kind of like Bush. You know how they say all these things about Bush that he did when he was young.
Yeah.
And now he's this role model.
Well, Bush,
I would say role model, but you know,
yeah,
he has
comment.
changed a lot. So
We hope so.
I
Yeah.
think it's kind of strange the hypocrisy in Islam at that time. You know, choosing somebody like Saladin to lead these holy people, quote unquote.
I don't think they chose him. I think that he rose to power, that he imposed himself on them. I don't think they chose him. What do you think?
I was going to say
Travis?
he chose himself.
He chose himself. Yeah, I think he did choose himself. But Islam kind of, that's the way they run things in the Islamic world. That they don't have elections. They don't elect people. They don't choose their rulers. Their rulers are imposed on them by circumstance or ambition or however they come to power. Yeah, Mary.
Again, you know, the same description on page 28, you know, it talks about he takes a single monarchy out of, and he claims all of the governments of so many kings, and they refer to it as a tyrant's greed. And he's not content with that the more he has, the more he wants.
Okay, you're describing, again, the Western account in the Chronicle of the Third Crusade on page 28, that the more he gets, the more he wants. They are seeing him as what the Western world calls a tyrant. The Western world, of course, the Franks are more into a more democratic style, where people have rights and where they elect people. Remember how the council at Jerusalem, the Barons' Council, elected the kings, or at least they married off the daughters to whoever they wanted to be king, and that's a form of election. And so here we have Saladin, you know, making himself. In fact, here on page 28, the Franks acknowledge that it was the caprice of fortune that wished for these rapid changes. She raises up a rich man from a pauper, the lofty from the humble, a ruler from a slave. Okay, so that they saw Saladin not as being elected, but as rising to power, and they accuse him of treacherously killing his uncle and other unsuspecting men, and so won the lordship of Egypt. Yeah, Travis, comment on that.
Well, I was going to talk about what she said, even from about how he wasn't satisfied with just that and he wanted more.
Yeah.
Even in the Arab Chronicles on page 101, it's the historian is quoting Saladin saying, "I think that when God grants me victory over the rest of Palestine, I shall divide my territories, make a will, stating my wishes, then set sail on the sea for their far-off lands and pursue the Franks there, so as to free the earth of
Yeah.
anyone who does not believe in God or die in the attempt."
Yeah.
He wouldn't have been satisfied with just Palestine.
Yeah, that he wouldn't necessarily have been satisfied that. Well, he thought about it. He thought about going to the west and conquering the Frankish lands as well and converting them to Islam, but not for his own gain, but to convert them to Islam. You have to note, so that's important. I kind of went through and I underlined some of the points on Saladin's character for what he was praised for. And these things, what he's praised for is a litany of virtues in the Islamic faith. I mean, he really fills this Islamic pattern for an ideal hero. He drew his faith from experts, so he didn't really, he didn't make things up by himself. But he drew his faith from experts, and he listened to them and believed them without being creative in his religion. Okay. He drew his faith from the evidence duly studied in the company of the most authoritative scholars and the greatest lawyers, acquiring sufficient competence to take his part in a theological discussion should one arise in his presence. Okay, he did not adopt the technical language used by specialists. The result of this was his faith was free of any taint of heterodoxy, and speculation never led him into any theological error or heresy. Okay, so he used ordinary language free of taint and speculation. He performed canonical prayers in public. Assiduously, he used to pray in public. And he said it had been years since he had practiced them any other way. As for the legal almsgiving, he died without giving a large enough estate to be subject to it, for his extra-canonic gifts had consumed all his wealth. In other words, by the time he died, he had already given away all his wealth, so he didn't have to be subject to the standard taxes of people who die. He had already given it away. As for Ramadan, there were Ramadans that he should have made up because of illnesses at various times. Okay, so he wasn't perfect. You're supposed to do Ramadan every year, but if you're ill, you're excused. You don't have to do Ramadan if you're ill. But you're supposed to make it up later, at a later time, by going on a fast. And he lacked some Ramadans that he should have made up. As for pilgrimage, he had always wanted and intended to go, in particular in the year of his death. He made a decision to go then and ordered the preparations to be made, but he never quite made it, which is kind of amazing because Mecca was not that far away from Egypt, was it? Mecca was very near to Egypt, so it's kind of amazing that he never really went. He kept putting it off. Maybe he had more important things to do. He kept putting it off until next year. But God decreed otherwise, as often happens in the experience of men, both great and small. He loved to hear the noble Quran recited, and he examined the imam whose job it was and required him to be learned in Quranic studies and to have a perfect knowledge and understanding of the text. That raises some questions in my mind. I mean, he is looking for the perfect learned man, imam, to read the Quran. How did he know who was perfect? I mean, this is quite interesting that he searched around for a perfect one, and evidently he put himself up as the judge for what made this man perfect, because he had to have a perfect knowledge and understanding of the text. At night when he was in his room, he would ask anyone who was awake to recite 2, 3, or 4 surahs of the Quran while he listened. And in public audiences, he would ask whoever had been appointed to the office to recite 20 or so verses. Okay, and so he loved to hear the Quran be recited and praised people who also recited the Quran. Yeah, Travis.
Was he unable to read, or was it not written down, and so they were reciting from memory?
Oh, good question. I don't know if he could read or not, but whether he could read or not, habitually the Quran is recited aloud. And like when we had our visitors here from our Islamic imam and he recited the Quran, often the prayers will be recitations of the Quran, and they will choose a verse of the Quran to recite as the prayer. And it's an oral thing. I mean, this started out as an oral culture, and so it's very oral. Reading the Quran aloud is a large part of their customs, whether he could read or not. Now, you assume that this is a literate culture because everybody is required to read the Quran in the original Arabic, and so one assumes that children are taught to read. And they certainly seem to be in the schools now. Yeah.
I was going to add that I go to a mosque every Wednesday, and there are no books. We recite.
You just
everything.
recite. Okay, so it's just a.
It's not like Catholicism where you have like a book to read from the verses and stuff.
Although in Catholicism, in the Middle Ages, there were no books for people to read from. They recited it from memory as well. So.
That's a new thing then.
Books are new things in the Catholic Church, yeah. Okay, he venerated deeply the laws of the faith, and of course the laws are all derived from the Quran. And so venerating the laws of the faith, he believed in the resurrection of the body, the reward of paradise for the virtuous, and of hell for sinners, and accepted all the teachings of Holy Scripture with an open heart. He hated philosophers, heretics, materialists, and all the opponents of the law. Okay, and he asked his son to punish a young man who called himself an enemy of the law and the heretic. and a heretic. He put his whole faith and confidence in God and turned to him for help. And then he tells little stories that illustrate Saladin doing this, putting his whole faith and trust in God. He was a just and merciful ruler, quick to help the weak against the strong. And here is a quotation from the Quran. The just prince is God. This is Abu Akbar the Truthful, who was the first Caliph, Muhammad's successor, said that the Prophet, God bless him and preserve him, said, "The just prince is God's shadow on earth and his mercy." So Islam looks at a prince or a ruler as divinely ordained, that God has chosen him to be the ruler. And Saladin probably had that view of himself, that God had chosen him because of his abilities. And so that's why. But he's described, and this is interesting, those who act loyalty to the ruler in private and before others will be set in the shadow of God's throne on the day when there shall be no shade but that. Those who betray him privately or publicly shall be abandoned by God on the day of resurrection. Okay, so that it is a cardinal rule of Islam that all believers are supposed to be loyal to their leader because their leader is ordained by God. Saladin was a good ruler. He was the kind of ruler that God wanted. Saladin was just, benign, merciful, quick to help the weak against the strong. Every Monday and Thursday he would give an audience and administer justice in public session in the presence of the lawyers, qadis, and scholars. He listened to the litigants, for all had access to him, great and small, old, hale, and sick. Whether on journeys or at home, he was ready to perform this office, always ready to receive the supplications addressed to him and to remove the abuses brought to his notice. He never turned away anyone who had suffered injustice and was seeking recompense. So this is one of the major roles of a ruler in Islam, is to render justice righteously to people. The just prince is God's shadow on earth and his mercy, as we said. His generosity is the next trait, which we've talked about before, examples of his generosity. The prophet said, "When the generous man stumbles, God takes his hand," and many other hadiths speak of generosity. Saladin's generosity was too widespread to be recorded here and too well known to need to mention. He used to give away whole provinces. I heard Saladin say in the course of conversation, "There might be a man here who looks on money as one looks on the dust in the road," by which he seemed to be referring to himself. Okay, so money meant nothing to him. He would give everything away. He spread largesse with a generous hand. Another trait that he is praised for is his courage and steadfastness. And again, in the beginning of this session, the prophet Muhammad is quoted. God loves courage, even in the killing of a serpent. And Saladin was indeed one of the most courageous of men, brave, gallant, firm, intrepid in any circumstance. And then he gives examples. He tells little stories about Saladin and how he was so brave and courageous. Now, the next quality is zeal in the holy war. Almighty God has said, and this is quoting the Quran, of course, "And those who fight for our cause, we shall guide them in our path, and God is with those who act with nobility." Saladin was more assiduous and zealous in holy war than in anything else. Once Saladin had gone forth on the holy war, he did not spend a dinar or a drachma except on the war or in gifts and donations. For love of the holy war and on God's path, he left his family and his sons, his homeland, his house, and all his estates, and chose out of all the world to live in the shade of his tents where the winds blew on him from every side. Several books on the subject of holy war were written for him. I was one of those who compiled one for his use, containing all the laws, Quranic verses, and hadith relating to the subject, with elucidations of the obscure terms. He often read it until his son Al-Malik al-Afdal took it from him. and so this chapter on holy war is really, really long, and the author of this story is his secretary. He says, "While I was standing thus, Saladin turned to me and said, 'I think that when God grants me victory over the rest of Palestine, I shall divide my territories, make a will stating my wishes, then set sail on this sea for their far-off lands and pursue the Franks there so as to free the earth of anyone who does not believe in God or die in the attempt.'" Okay, so this is a commentary on holy war, and this is the aim of holy war, is to convert everybody, to free the earth of anyone who does not believe in God. Okay. This is a comment by the author. "Your Majesty, not content with extirpating God's enemies from a certain part of the earth, wishes to purify the whole world." Okay. "What is the most noble death? Death in God's path," I said. "Well then, the worst that can befall me is the most noble of deaths." All right. Humanity and forgiveness is the next. Well, his endurance and determination to win merit in God's eyes. Almighty God said, "And then they fought for God's cause and endured, and your Lord is forgiving and merciful." So endurance and determination to win merit in God's eyes is another characteristic he's praised for. "I was there when news came to him of the death of his little son Ismael. He read the letter and spoke to no one. We had to learn about it from others. He betrayed no reaction except that as he read the letter his eyes filled with tears." Gary, did you have a comment? No. Okay. Okay, examples of his humanity and forgiveness. God has said, "And those among men who pardon others," and God loves those who act rightly. He was indulgent to those who failed and slow to wrath. God said to his prophet, "You are truly a magnanimous man, and it seems to me that your Majesty shares this quality with him." To which Saladin replied, "It did not cost anything. We heard what he wanted, and we wanted to recompense him." Sometimes when the crowd thronged round him to present their pleas, the cushion on which he sat ended up crushed underfoot, yet he did not seem to mind at all. So he had this humanity and forgiveness. Sometimes he was addressed in the most insulting manner by postulants and plaintiffs. His reaction to it was always cheerful and benevolent. Okay, and he's got anecdotes to illustrate all of these things. His unfailing goodness. The prophet said, "I was sent to reveal clearly the soul's most noble qualities, and when someone seized his hand, he did not withdraw it until the man let go of his own accord." And so he was devoted to unfailing goodness, and so he remained good. Okay, I have here, finally, as we get to the end, a list of comments in chapter 2. This is events preceding Hatim, where we have discord between the Franks in Syria, and the Count of Tripoli joined Saladin's side. Prince Arnott committed treachery. What did you think about the Franks joining Saladin's side?
Doesn't really surprise me. The Franks seem to be some of the most fickle people. They're willing to change allegiances just for the betterment of their own prestige.
Yes, well, this is one of the problems with democracy and free will and freedom of movement, that you have people who choose to do things that go against their fellows, and that's what happens with them. Okay, the Battle of Hattin is described here in great detail, and all his attacks on, of course, the Battle of Hattin is the beginning of the end, the Horns of Hattin, where the Holy Land is going to fall. And then we've already talked about the treatment of the Templars and the Hospitallers, all of whom he had his men behead. In the fall of Jerusalem, Saladin's treatment of the prisoners This is interesting. You know, we were talking about the women at the beginning of the class and how he treated them. When he conquered Jerusalem, he was very good to some of the noble women in this other chronicle. It tells that he was quite lenient with them. There was in Jerusalem a woman married to a Byzantine king who became a nun and settled there with a great train of domestic slaves and handmaids and a quantity of gold and precious stones. She asked for safe conduct for herself and her dependents, and the Sultan granted it and let her go. In the same way, he set at liberty the queen of Jerusalem, who would have been Sibella, the wife of Guy of Lusignan, whose husband, imprisoned by Saladin, became king of the Franks through her agency and ruled the kingdom as her viceroy. He also let her take her possessions and dependents, and she asked permission to join her husband, who was then held prisoner in the fortress of Nablus. This was granted, and she went and stayed with him. The wife of the prince Arnot of Al-Karak, whom Saladin had killed with his own hand on the day of Hattin, also came before him to intercede for his son, who was a prisoner. Saladin said, "If you will give me Al-Karak, I will let him go." And she went to Al-Karak, but the other Franks wouldn't give it to him. They held on to it. So they didn't let her son go. The Grand Patriarch of the Franks left the city with the treasures from the Dome of the Rock, the Masjid al-Aqsa, and the Church of the Resurrection, and others. God alone knows the amount of the treasure. He also took an equal quantity of money, but Saladin made no difficulties. Okay, he let all these Franks go with tons of riches that he could have taken as loot, and you can't help but think that the chroniclers here are holding Saladin up as a mirror to the Franks of how horrible they've been, you know, because all the other histories tell how the Franks loot and kill, and here is Saladin being very lenient to all these Franks. At the top of the cupola of the Dome of the Rock there was a great gilded cross, and they climbed up to the top, and a great cry from the city went up and from outside the wall, the Muslims crying the Allah Akbar in their joy, and the Franks groaning in consternation and grief. So loud and piercing was the cry that the earth shook. Once the city was taken and the infidels had left, Saladin ordered that the shrines should be restored to their original state. And then he talks about how the Templars had defiled all of the mosques, and he went through and he restored everything, and the restoration of all these Muslim shrines. Okay. And then he starts marching toward the other cities. Okay, I mentioned Saladin's good works. He restores the mosques and the madrasas. The victory of Islam. The victory of Islam was clear, and so was the death of unbelief. And this is how they saw the conquest of Jerusalem, as a victory of Islam. The city became Muslim, and the infidel belt around it was cut. Okay, he absolutely refused to grant amnesty to anyone. Okay. And their response was that without bravura, they feared the consequences of a sudden decision and communicated their fear. They said, "If we must despair of your mercy and fear your power and lose all hope of your magnanimity, and if we are sure that there is no escape or way out, no peace or safety, no grace or generosity, then we shall seek death and shall fight like men who sell their lives dearly. We shall face life with death and advance like men going with bowed heads to perdition. We shall hurl ourselves like men who rush into the attack expecting instant death. And we shall cast ourselves into the fire, but we shall not bring about our ruin and dishonor at our own hand." And so here is the honor of the Franks that causes them to feel like they have to fight to the bitter end. Okay, and he also paints the Franks in this very bad light. When Saladin captured Jerusalem, he levied a tax on all unbelievers. Once the tax had been fixed, they surrendered the city on Friday, 2 October, surrendering it under duress like ill-gotten gains rather than a legitimate deposit. Again, the wife of an imprisoned king, the daughter of King Amalric, lived near Jerusalem with all her serving women, domestics, and handmaidens. She too left unhindered. But he says some of the Franks stayed there and paid the tax and wanted to live in the city. Okay, we've looked at this subjugation of women that they did. That was a good passage you saw. But Saladin's good works in Jerusalem were largely consisted of restoring the mosques. Okay, and he restored the churches are suppressed, the mosques are restored, and the madrasas are instituted. Okay, the oratory of David outside the Masjid al-Aqsa was Saladin who gave it new life and beauty and enabled visitors to enjoy it. He gave orders for all the mosques to be renovated and all the sanctuaries to be guarded. Okay. We already did the Frankish women of peace and war. Finally, we have the praise of the King of England, Richard Lionheart, the arrival of the kings of France and England. The King of England was a very powerful man among the Franks, a man of great courage and spirit. So they admired Richard Lionheart for his qualities that were like Saladin's. He fought great battles and showed a burning passion for war. His kingdoms and standings were inferior to those of the French king, but his wealth, reputation, and valor were greater. Okay, so the King of England arrived after coming to terms with the King of Cyprus, and his arrival made an enormous impression. He appeared with 25 ships full of men, arms, and equipment, and the Franks made a great display of joy and lit fires that night among their tents. Okay, let's take a break, and when we'll come back, we'll look at the King of England as the Western hero and what qualities there are in him that make him a hero.